Right. We are going to get started. Elena, I want to move to the land acknowledgement slide, and Elena will get us started here.
Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome and thank you for coming. First of all, November is National Native American Heritage Month. I acknowledge and celebrate the continuing contributions of Alaska Natives and American Indians to the sciences, the humanities, art, education, and many more. I invite you to do the same. I'm joining you on this event from the University of Alaska Fairbanks that sits on Troth Yedda, Indian Potato Ridge, on the traditional and unceded homelands of the Lower Tanana Dene people. I gratefully acknowledge and honor them, their past and current relationship to and care of the land. I am committed to building long-term reciprocal partnerships with Indigenous individuals and organizations in support of their work for equity and justice, sovereignty, and self-determination. Please take a moment to acknowledge whose lands you are on from where you are joining today. Thank you.
Thanks, Elena. And if you want to go ahead and acknowledge whose lands you're joining us from today, you can add that to our chat. So the NNA Cooperative Office Broader Impacts Network is really a chance for us to periodically learn from each other and connect with each other. And because of that, we've decided to rename these BIN meetings to be the Learn and Connect series. So you might have noticed that name shift in our Eventbrite for this occasion. We are located across 3 campuses. So Alaska Pacific University, APU, University of Alaska Fairbanks, and the University of Colorado Boulder, where we're joining you from today. So today we have a panel of experts today. They're going to talk to us about communicating your research with the Alaskan communities. I'm going to let them each introduce themselves when they talk, but we wanted to start with a quick poll today, just so that we can make sure that we're addressing some of your concerns and your issues when it comes to communicating your research. So let's do a quick Mentimeter poll. So if you've never done Mentimeter before, you go to www.menti.com in another browser window, and you can enter the code 4118-6030, or you can scan this QR code. I'm going to leave this up for a second here, and then we'll switch over. All right, so our first question here is, have you connected with reporters or media when you go into the field for your field work? Looks like we have more people that do connect with media or reporters when they go into the field than don't. But we might be catching up here. Another 10 seconds for this. Ooh, we're closer to split now. Okay. All right. Let's do our next question. Do you have experience developing a newsletter for a specific community that you work with? So we're interested if anyone has experience developing a newsletter for the communities that they work with or in. All right, we have more no's than yeses this time, but we're still pretty split. All right, let's do our third question today. Do you have experience creating a podcast? Has anyone created a podcast before? right. A lot of no's, but a few yeses. We have some podcasters amongst us. All right. 3 more seconds to answer, and let's do our final question because it's going to take us, it's a little more free response, the next one. In 1 to 2 words, what are the challenges that you face when you think about any of those 3 things we just talked about? Reaching out to media, developing a newsletter, or creating a podcast. So this will create a word
Or a
cloud.
story map.
Or a story map. Sorry, thank you. I forgot to add that. Or a story map. So what issues are you facing when you're thinking about communicating your research through any of these means? And we'll pause here for a second and give you a chance to think about any issues or challenges that you face and get those down in our word cloud. All right, we're getting some good words in here. I'm seeing language barrier, technology, time, family, fears, having photos or media, accessing the audience, needing more skills, expectations, attention, simplifying, interview prep, jargon. These are all great issues that hopefully we will address some of these today. Just a quick note on the format of this panel. Each of our speakers are going to have about 8 to 10 minutes to tell us about their lived experience communicating their research. And then we'll have just a few minutes for questions and discussion at the end. But that doesn't mean that you should hold your questions, because sometimes we forget questions. So if a question comes to mind, go ahead and type it in the chat, and we'll make sure that we address that in the discussion portion at the end. And with that, I would like to hand this over to Heather to get us started.
All right. Good morning. I'm Heather McFarland. I'm at the International Arctic Research Center, and I'm a science communicator. And I'm going to talk about newsletters. Newsletters are my absolute favorite. They combine all the things that I love. I'm super visual. I have a hard time reading massive amounts of things. And so newsletters provide this cool opportunity to combine visuals and written content in a really interesting way. Some of the perks of newsletters is that they allow you to communicate regularly. Once you find your audience or identify who they are, you have direct access to them, and it allows you to share your results when they come in, provide project updates. And I think it's a really cool way to, like I said, communicate regularly, so you're not just waiting till the end of the project when you have your final big paper, because you've been communicating all along. So you can really bring people along on the journey. And the other thing that's really cool about newsletters is that you can do deep dives, because you hopefully will be communicating more regularly, you have more space. And one thing I wanted to point out is that if you have a more focused newsletter that's for, let's say, a specific community, you can go even deeper, because people who are from a really specific community might be more interested in knowing the nitty-gritty details of your research than if you sent it to a huge number of people. So for example, I did this newsletter called ArcGIS, and it was focused specifically on the community of Kotzebue. And we were able to provide a lot of really detailed information about results and project updates. And people were really pumped about it because they cared a lot about their community. Whereas some of the other newsletters that I've done, like Bearing Science, for example, is for the entire region of from the Aleutians up to the Bering Strait. And so we don't do as deep of dives because our audience is a lot more broad. Next slide, please. So types of newsletters, there are 2 ways that you can do this. You can go electronic or you can go print. Of course, electronic has a lot of perks. It's a whole lot cheaper. You there's a lot of templates that you can use, like I use MailChimp, so it's quicker. You don't have to do as much design work. But some of the caveats are that you have to have really good internet, and there's a lot of electronic newsletters out there. And so how will your electronic newsletter stand out in somebody's email inbox when they're getting 10 other newsletters a day? Print, on the other hand, is really good for rural Alaska, where people often have low bandwidth. It's also, there's something about having a paper copy of something in your hands that makes it more fun to read. That said, the caveats there are that you generally need a lot more design skills. A lot of print newsletters are created in programs like Adobe InDesign. So it's a little bit more technical to create a print newsletter, and it's costly because generally you have to print, and then oftentimes we mail newsletters out to rural communities, and that is cost money. So you got to choose what your purpose is, and then figure out which of these options is the best for you. Next slide. How do you improve your success once you pick whether you're doing an electronic or print newsletter? Well, first off, newsletter success for me is all about writing style. We want to keep our writing style to kind of a middle school level. We're talking about oftentimes a lot of really complex things. So it's okay to do that, but make sure that you're not using jargon, that your sentence structure is really short and snappy. So I often do short sentences and short paragraphs, like 3, maybe 4 sentences in each paragraph. Keep people engaged, don't make them wade through a lot of text. I also use really descriptive headers. So this screenshot here is from one of my newsletters, and I try and pick headers that are going to get people excited, because you really want to plan for somebody who is going to give you 3 seconds, 30 seconds, or 3 minutes. So those 3-second people are the ones that are going to be skimming your newsletter, looking for pictures or headers that connect with them. And if you catch them, they might read a little bit more in depth. They're going to give you 30 seconds. And so then provide a little bit more detail that they can skim through at the 30-second level. And then there's those people that are actually going to read your newsletter. And I try and design my newsletter with all 3 of those types of people in mind. And so everything that I create is really visual, has a lot of headers. The data can be easily grasped. If I provide a graph, I, often write in a full sentence, like this bullet point means the number of days in a hunting season, rather than somebody having to turn their head to the left and read the axes to figure out what you're talking about. The other thing I want to point out is, especially if you're doing a newsletter for a rural community or any community, but a specific group of people, they really want to see your data. Like, people care about the data that you're gathering from the area where they live. But that data needs to be displayed in a way that they can grasp quickly. And that doesn't require a PhD to understand. So I often remake a lot of my graphs. I take the graphs that are, were created for scientific publication, and I remake them with full sentences that describe what each axis is. I use, metrics that people understand, like, if I don't use abbreviations in the labels and things like that. I just try to make it as simple as possible. Next slide. A little bit more on results. One of the pieces of feedback that I've received a lot with the newsletters I've created is that people love hearing about results, but they want to know why. And so that's one of the biggest things that I try and incorporate in my newsletters, is provide that data on their home, but connect with what they care about. Make sure that, if you're saying that salmon populations are declining, well, why are they declining? What do we have any idea about the implications of how that decline is going to impact the whole system? So it's really important to ask those questions. And sometimes we don't know the answer. And one of the things that I had a discussion last year when I was working on this newsletter called Bearing Science, some of the issues with salmon decline, the scientists didn't know the answers. And we have a community advisory panel, and the community advisory panel said, well, if you don't know the implications of what that change is, just say, we don't know why they're declining. Like, it's better to be just honest in where you're at than to just kind of throw out some random data and then try and make somebody decide what it means. The other thing that I often do is, if you don't know what the data means yet, answer the question about why you even asked the question to begin with. Like, why? So, don't just say the sea ice was 6 millimeters thick. Well, what does that matter? Like, why did you want to know how thick the sea ice was? So ask those questions, provide that context, because people will provide the context themselves if you don't provide it for them. And so it's way better for you to set the stage for them than for them to have to try and figure that out themselves. Another thing that I wanted to mention about this, why does it matter, is this is a really great place to incorporate local perspectives. I work on this other newsletter called AOK, and there's a bunch of rural observers from across Arctic Alaska. And this bottom screenshot, these are all their observations of the changes they're observing. And it's really, people really like to see insights from somebody they know. So incorporating the knowledge from rural communities is really valuable, and showing that, providing the space for that kind of contribution is pretty amazing. So next slide. So newsletters are fantastic. I love them dearly. I do a lot of them. But there are some times when newsletters are not your best option. The first one is if you don't know who your audience is. Don't just create a newsletter because that's what people are doing these days. Create a newsletter because you have a specific group of people who you want to connect with. So, and think about how, not just why are you wanting to connect with them, but how do you actually anticipate getting the newsletter to them? Because that's a little complicated. Like, if you want to get a newsletter out to a group of individuals that's an electronic newsletter, how are you going to get their email addresses? How are you going to get them to sign up to be a part of your newsletter? So kind of think through those logistics before you dive into creating something that takes a lot of time and energy. But you want to make sure that you're actually going to get it to the people who you want to connect with. The second one is if you have too little time or resources or skills to tailor the writing and design to your audience. As you might have kind of guessed all along, like, the best newsletters are specifically designed and tailored to whoever you're connecting with. And if you don't have the time to do that, your newsletter may not come out very well. So make sure that you block off enough time to work on this. And then my last point is that newsletters are great for that, like, semi-regular communication, like quarterly, monthly, once a year. They're not so great if you want to communicate on a daily basis, or you want them to communicate back and forth with you. This top thing is a screenshot of the Fresh Eyes on Ice, which is a part of the NNA community office. And it is a Facebook group, and they are communicating like all day long, and the people within that community are communicating with one another. They're sharing ice stories, and it's this like really like natural back and forth. And that's a really fantastic tool, and it's totally different from a newsletter. The other reason why you may not want to do a newsletter is if you just want to communicate very rarely. Like, let's say you have a final finding for your publication or for your research project, and you want to tell the world about it. Well, maybe a press release or something like that is or connecting, like what Rod's going to talk next about connecting with local media. That might be a better approach than creating a newsletter, because with a newsletter, you're really trying to set up this system where you're going to communicate with them consistently. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Rod Boyce who is another amazing communicator here at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. He's at the Geophysical Institute. He has a long history as an editor in Alaska, and he's amazing. So go, Rod. You're muted.
Yep, got it. Good morning, everyone. Heather, you can keep going with the compliments there. That'd be fine. No, this is great. As Heather said, I do have a long history. What I want to do is just touch on that very briefly, and then I want to mention some of the challenges in getting publicity for science stories. And then I want to go quickly into the situation facing reporters today. And then I've got like about 11 tips I want to pass on to you all. So I'm going to try to cram all that in, and let's see how it goes. So I've been in newspapers, well, had been until a year and a half ago when I came to the Geophysical Institute, for just over 30 years, and almost all of that was in daily newspapers. I actually started at a newspaper working on carbon. We used to use old manual typewriters with carbon paper. Now I've seen the whole other end of it with the internet. So I've seen a lot of change, and what that means also for science coverage. Science stories have always been difficult to get in because they're not seen as the core mission of a local paper. Local papers will cover city government, cops and courts, the school district, and local feature stories. Science stories have always been a hard sell. And one of the reasons for that is they don't fit into the easy formula, if you will, of a city council story where reporter will just pay attention to one issue, get some comments from either side, put it in some background, bing, they're done, and they're on to the next story. Science stories take a little bit more brain power, and I have found that out as the public info person here at the GI. It takes me a lot longer to understand something than it would have understanding a local government story. So science story is always a challenge, and it's complicated by the media environment we're in. So if we can go to the next slide, please. You can see here, reporters are asked to do so much more. When I started at the Fairbanks Daily News Miner, that was 27 years ago, was a good sized staff. It increased. I became the editor of the paper in 2008. We had 28 people on staff. When I left at the beginning of 2021, there were 12. All right. At the same time, the demand for the content to fill the holes in the paper didn't change. And in fact, increased in some areas because we added 2 magazines. So what that means for the reporter, covering more beats, more subject areas. You might have one reporter doing the police beat, covering the city, covering general features, and maybe they'll do science because they're interested in science. But having a dedicated science reporter is a luxury that small, medium-sized newspapers and TV stations just don't have. All right. So next slide. You'll see this here is, what's this one? Oh, the pressure to perform. This is really interesting and happened in about the last year and a half at my time at the paper. Paying attention to what's getting clicks, and that dictates decision-making on what stories to be covered. So that's why we end up with more crime stories, more kind of clickbaity stuff, if you will. And that's because those clicks translate to revenue, advertising revenue. So you can see how that influences an editor's decision-making and what the reporter is then asked to do. So that's yet another pressure for reporters. We had a big monitor in the newsroom where we could see each day what people were clicking on, what they were reading. And I remember going and saying, okay, well, we better pay more attention to this than this over here, even though this thing over here might be more important, like a science story. All right. So next slide, please. Let's see where we are. Okay, so the whole thing here is to make things easier for a reporter. Reporters have much less time to do a story than they used to. You need to help them in that way. And this kind of goes into something Heather touched on, which is to keep things simple. All right. So what I want to do now is go into these little tips I have here. Something that I've gleaned over the long years. I've had to turn away people when they come in without giving enough notice. And I'm going to start with that one. That's really key. if you have a research paper coming out, you know probably the publication date well in advance of it being published. Don't wait until the day of publication to tell a reporter, hey, I got this thing that got published today, it's really important. Well, that's not going to give them time to set up, to understand it. And so give as much notice as you can, whether it's on that or inviting a reporter to go into the field, for example, all right? They'll have to make arrangements with the editor and so on. Let's go to, let's see. All right, so we're going to go slideless here for a minute here for a couple of these points. When you approach a media outlet, you need to emphasize the local point, the local aspect to it, whether it's of the research itself, or if not the research itself, if it's got a person involved. If the research was conducted in the newspaper's backyard, for example, or if people who assisted with the research are from that community, and if you yourself are from that community. Here's something interesting. We have a researcher here who does a lot of sea ice research. Well, she's from a small town in Oklahoma. Not a lot of sea ice there, but they keep tabs on what she does. So I wrote about her work. I contacted the paper there. Sure enough, they wrote about her. All right, with that. So look for people connections locally, and you need to localize the research. And the next one is super key. I call it photos, photos, photos. If we can have that slide back up, please. Let's see here. Yep, this ties into not only the use on social media, but also in print. As an editor, you want photos with the story, whether it's in print or online. It's photos that will attract the eye. That's where people look. It just really grabs them. A story without photos just doesn't resonate as much. You can see here, the more images you have, the better likelihood it's going to get looked at. So another thing with photos is when you're in the field, make sure you're taking some, all right? Oftentimes, newsrooms don't have photographers to send out. This is another thing, by the way. Reporters are so multitasking now. They are doing the social media. They have to take the photos because photographers have been laid off over the years of downsizing. So it's important that you provide photos. Usually it's good if you're in the photo too. Okay, this one is important. It's when to make contact with local media, all right? You need to give them some advance notice, like I touched on earlier, but there are some tips on doing that. I know from my experience as a daily newspaper editor, I would come in Monday morning and I'd be scrambling trying to fill out the whole week. So you can approach an editor early Monday, later in the day Monday, because they're trying to fill their slots for the week. And I imagine it's the same for TV stations as well. They're trying to get their reporters lined out. Also, at the end of the week, Thursday, anytime Thursday or Friday morning is good, because editors, sometimes like myself, would get into a panic with the holes you have to fill on the weekend. You have space in the paper, you come up short sometimes when you have a short staff and you're out of ideas. That's a good time to approach somebody to say, hey, here's a quick and easy story. You have to make it simple, remember, with some photos. They may grab onto it right away. So that's another tip. Related to that is when not to approach media, and that is late on a Friday. There's always the running joke about the Friday at 5 p.m. press release. And that, it gets frustrating for editors and reporters because they don't have much time, if any, at that point, to get something in the next day. And Friday at 5 is a running joke because that's usually when politicians will, send out that press release of, I'm resigning to spend more time with my family because of, the unspoken scandal X. All right, so that's kind of a running joke. following up with your press release. Don't overdo it. Don't assume your email, your contact, if you're sending an email, don't assume they've got it. You may follow up, within a day or two, make sure they got it, but don't badger them, all right? And lastly here, as I start to run out of time here, get help. Use your public information officer if there is one. That person has the media connections. They can help prepare you for an interview. I saw that in the word cloud. Interview prep was one of the things. So they can help you in so many ways to get out the news about your research. One other thing here before I hand it off to Carly is in the word cloud, I saw the word misquoted in there. This is important. When you're being interviewed, you can always ask the reporter to read the quote back to you. Ask them what quotes they're going to use in the story. You can ask them to send you the story. They're not going to, 9 times out of 10, maybe more than that. But they should be able to read you back the quotes that they're going to use. And so I think that's it. One last thing on my list, sorry, is if you're coming to Alaska and you're in a remote area, don't expect there to be a media person there. Media is sparse in the state, and in those rural communities where there is a media outlet, a newspaper or a radio station, it probably consists of one journalist, nothing more. So anything you can do, and this should be the overriding thing, to make it easy on the reporter and editor and keep it simple. That's the best advice to getting your news in the local media and elsewhere. All right. So with that, as I run out of breath here, I'm going to hand it off to Carly at Alaska Pacific University. Carly?
Thanks, Rod. So my name is Carly Tyant-Sassel. I am Anishinaabe, and I currently serve as the Indigenous Engagement Coordinator for the NNA Community Office, and I'm based at APU, as Rod had mentioned. And I'm co-host of the Arctic Together podcast. Who's listened to the podcast so far? Feel free to put it in the chat. Disclaimer, I am not a podcast expert, and I'm still learning alongside all of you about the intricacies of podcasting production, even putting together these slides. I learned a lot. So you want to start a podcast in the middle of a podcast boom. For those on the Zoom today, I saw that some of you are already posting podcasts, which is awesome. Feel free to also share those in the chat. And for those of you who are not having podcasts yourself, do you have a favorite podcast? Feel free to share those too in the chat. But I just kind of wanted to share some quick podcast stats that might provide a little bit more clarity on who listens to podcasts and what your potential audience is. So as of 2022, I think about 65% of Americans actually listen to podcasts at least some point in their lifetime, with a large majority of listeners who are between the ages of 12 to 34 years of age. And 60% of podcast listeners actually tune into listening from their home, and then the other are tuning in from their cars, on your morning or commutes or your drive home. But the average length of podcasts are about 30 minutes long. And the top podcast listening apps are Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcasts. So why are podcasts so effective, and why are they booming? I think it's kind of interesting to think about the psychology of podcasts and why they're so impactful. I read that the retention rate of auditory learning is 2 times higher than reading and 4 times higher than, say, attending a lecture. And so audio is one of the most kind of intimate forms of media because you're constantly building your own images in your head, your own story in your head. And so in a sense, this is kind of a deep act of like co-authorship, as you visualize the story. And I think in doing that, you kind of develop some potential for empathy and personal connection and understanding. So those are just some podcasts stats. And these are from 2020, but I just did a quick Google search and there are now 2.4 million podcasts kind of worldwide. Next slide. So yeah, podcasts are really the fastest growing form of media, but they can be tricky to create and even harder to sustain. So if you're interested in having your own podcast, really think specifically why you want to start a podcast versus like a blog or a newsletter, like a YouTube channel or Instagram feed, or, you know, another media outlet. So really find out if a podcast is the best way to tell your story, and what you really need or don't need in order to get started. So finding your voice. It's really great to kind of get your co-hosts together or a team to brainstorm or formulate a sustainable plan and come up with like a snappy pitch. You know, getting started can be tricky. And one thing to think about is to perhaps bring in other people from your institution or organization that maybe have interest in also having a podcast, so you could share space, whether it's, you know, equipment or a media room, because equipment can be costly to purchase and set up and maintain. So, you know, what is your show going to be about? How would you describe what you want to do with the show in 2 to 3 sentences? It's important to think about, you know, your target audience. Is it high school students or is it researchers? You know, your content, use of language and tone should then appeal to those listeners. And perhaps you want to even reach an international audience. You know, this may require translation or language services, or even working with local community members to ensure that your message is accessible. And think about how your show is going to be structured. So one thing I recommend is kind of creating a step-by-step plan to kind of map out the show. You know, you're thinking about length, different segments, interviews, advice, and then take a look at other aspects of other successful podcasts that maybe you really like, and then you can adapt those to your own. So for example, maybe there's like 2 or 3 questions that you ask every guest speaker who comes on the episode. What are your in-between clips going to be like? Is it going to be music? Do you want to create like a raw or creative feel with audio clips from, you know, lands and waters? Like, is it, you know, a rushing river or like a trickling stream? Those are really cool kind of things to include in your podcast. Another thing to think about is video. And I was researching, and apparently only about 17% of podcasts have a recorded video that goes along with their audio. But this number is actually increasing. And I recently learned that Spotify might actually allow video soon with your podcast, which is kind of cool. And one tip is to kind of have separate audio and video files, which makes things a little bit easier for editing and post-production. So for instance, if you have like 4 speakers, they should all have their own audio files so you can balance the tone or feedback of each person, because everyone kind of talks differently with different cadence. And having microphones that eliminate the hard P's or the S's in speech, for example, that's kind of important because those things can be really distracting to listeners. And thinking about logistics is important. So audio quality is vital. You know, there's nothing worse than listening to a podcast that has choppy audio or distracting static in the background. You can record videos over Zoom and have separate audio to reduce feedback, for example. And there are also portable mics available that you can take into the field. And you can even use your smartphone these days, which is awesome. And there are actually a ton of free audio and editing software online and affordable services that offer post-production or transcription. And there are a lot of starter podcast guides online as well that can kind of help you find the right setup for you. And that's within your budget as well. And so, you know, building your audience, there are a lot of main ways that people listen to podcasts or discover new podcasts. Some of them come up on your listening apps. A lot of the time it's through word of mouth, you know, sharing from friends. Sometimes it's promotions or through ads, which also costs money to do as well. And so what? Building your audience. One thing that I learned is that it's really hard to build and sustain an audience, you know, keep people interested. That's a challenge. And also working in Alaska, low bandwidth in rural communities is another thing. So, maybe podcasts aren't the most accessible approach, but you could maybe find ways for sharing your podcast through, the local radio station, for example. And I always say never underestimate the power of printed materials. Another thing you could do is potentially even host like a teleconference call and have a phone interview and record that interview with a community member or, a local celebrity. So, building your community can include sharing your podcast across social media, across your organization's accounts, working with community members to promote or even lead and co-host your show. That's an awesome approach as well. And then there's something called Podbean, which can really get detailed listener statistics and track that for you. And so it's kind of like a one-stop shop to also upload your podcast across multiple platforms as well. Podcasting can be a full-time job, maybe you have a student who's interested in kind of helping out, and it's important to kind of build that into your budget for adequate compensation too. Next slide. So maybe podcasting isn't for you. It takes a lot of work, but if you're part of an NNA project, I would consider reaching out to us at the NNA Community Office, which recently started the Arctic Together podcast. We do have one episode, part 1 and 2, that are about 45 minutes long. But the target audience of this podcast are people of the Arctic, NNA researchers, practitioner, local community members, and really those who are interested in learning from local knowledge holders or who want to know about the NNA program and different projects. We share a lot about working with community, what the best practices are and some methodology. And it's really our hope to kind of improve communications about different research processes or project specific stories and share personal testimony or stories in kind of a fun, informal way. And so the first episode features topics about co-production of knowledge and equity. We kind of have some celebrities, artists and musicians who are Alaska Native, and they're really big on the music and art scene, which was a lot of fun. And our next episode, we're going to be hosting, it's going to be part of the annual meeting that's coming up in a couple of weeks. We're working with 15 climate communicators at the Anchorage Museum to conduct mini interviews with meeting attendees. So if you're around at the meeting, come stop by and maybe get a chance to get interviewed and talk about your project. But that map there on the right, you can kind of see that Podbean tracks statistics like, who tuned in, where are they from, where did they listen, what platform. So those are just some cool, interesting things about the Arctic Together podcast. And we also focus on kind of rotating Arctic regions and topics. But feel free to reach out to me too if you have any questions about the podcast. Next slide. With each podcast, we also have like a resource guide or show notes is what we call it, that talks a bit more about our guest speakers. It has like a bio, includes some of the work that they're involved in. And it's kind of cool to include some resources and links and just kind of a one-stop shop to learn a bit more about the different guests and their work. And again, if you have like a story to share, or if you're interested in being a guest, or if you have ideas for future episodes, we're more than happy to kind of sit down or have a call and chat about those. Feel free to send me an email too. That was a lot of information. I went through it really quickly, but if you have any other, questions, feel free to reach out to. But for now, I'll hand it over to Mike, who's a science communicator at the International Arctic Research Center at UAF.
Thanks so much, Carly. I'm just going to give some information about ArcGIS StoryMaps. So you can see here on the right, I'm helping to explain a little bit what a story map is. This is from the AOK story map. In fact, the author of this story map is in the room. Hi, Roberta. So this story map is combining a lot of different media. It's a single web page. As you scroll through that web page, you see maps, you see photos, you see videos. Right now, you are watching an audio recording play that you can't hear because this is a GIF. But this is the whole nature of the story map idea, is we are combining text that's catered to what's going to the story being told, and you're tying that to images from your data, photos from the field, geographic points where things are happening. And it's kind of a multimedia display through the web. It's part of the ArcGIS online ecosystem specifically. So we are not talking here about the broader kind of New York Times style story maps web pages. Those are kind of custom built and custom designed, and I don't know all that much about that. So we're specifically talking about this ecosystem. Next slide. So what do you need to be successful with a story map? You need access to ArcGIS Online and a willingness to engage with the strictures and peculiarities that come with that ecosystem. And you need time and a variety of high quality media. You need to have recorded interviews. You need photos from your collaborators, photos from the field, video of whatever it is you're filming. You need to get creative. You might have to redesign. You might have to go back to what Heather was mentioning earlier about redrawing or redesigning graphs or charts or re-exporting your data in a more visually friendly way. But it can be a really powerful way to tell a story, a really powerful way to connect data in context. I think that's the most powerful part of doing story maps, is it puts everything into the context of one another. It builds a web of relationships between images that people can relate to and data that's collected or stories that are told. And there's a couple of things that make it particularly great, particularly well done. And that is when you have, next slide, that is when you have a clear geographic theme. This is the NABOS 2021 cruise story map. And there is an incredibly clear geographic theme here. We are following researchers on a boat, and each time there is an update, that update is coming from a point. So you can see in order the latitude and longitude of the ship when our short update was uploaded. And so you can follow the cruise around as NABOS continues its expedition. That's the North Amundsen Basin Observation System, I think is what it's called. And so what we were getting was individual images and short stories from the field in a very limited ecosystem. And so that's what we're telling you here. We've got a clear story arc. The boat's gonna load up, it's gonna leave, it's gonna come back. It's tailor-made for telling a story, arc of a story beginning to end. We got a variety of media in this particular case. In the last one, you were watching the Glacial Lake Outburst Flooding story map put together by Molly Tankersley, which is a story that happens outside of Juneau every year. And so she had all this media, all of these interviews. In this case, we're not making sense of a complete result, but that is one way in which this can be really helpful, is if you are done. Going back to the AOK story map, this was a kind of story about how the project had formed, what data had been collected, what the results were, all in kind of a nice, neat package. If you were trying to follow along the process of the AOK story, you'd probably be wanting to read their quarterly newsletter where they're putting out, this is what happened this year, this is what, so there were different methods of communication are serving different purposes. So that's what you want here. And I would say you need 2 out of these 4 minimum to have a good story map material. You need that theme, the arc, the media, and or a complete result to build a story around. Next up. So a couple of cases where you might be missing that, where you might want to go instead, if you don't have a clear grounding to place and you're lacking media. Say you got back home and you didn't take any photos. You've got like 3 photos, they're grainy on your phone. You didn't interview anybody. You didn't think about this ahead of time. Well, maybe you need to move towards a print product where you hire an illustrator to make sense of what's going on. And so there's an example of one of those. If you have a target that has limited access to high-speed internet, these are very data-intensive web pages. You are auto-playing video, you are feeding audio, you are loading, in some of these cases, hundreds of photos straight up into someone's computer, and it's all automated, right? That's the whole idea, is that it's interactive. As you scroll, videos play. As you scroll, maps move. Well, that takes quite a bit of processing power and data bandwidth. So once again, we have the AOK project where this end story is highly data intensive, but for communicating data to the field, we've got a print product, right? So that's how you address these individual audiences in different cases. So if you do have limited high-speed internet access, you might want to be thinking about a print product, or you might want to just do interviews in the field. So we did an interview at KYUK in Bethel a couple of months ago, and that was kind of our mechanism for communication right there in the radio station with the folks who work there at KYUK. If you want more GIS functionality as well, some of you might be familiar with ArcGIS, but not have worked in ArcGIS Online. You'll know that the ArcGIS Online version of the ecosystem is significantly pared down. There's stuff you can't do. It doesn't have analytical processes. If you're looking to do real-time querying of, that's probably not the approach you want to go. In that case, you might need to partner with an organization, start the shameless plug like the Scenarios Network for Alaskan Arctic Planning that can build you some kind of bespoke web app that does the kind of things you want to do. And here's an example of that with the Northern Climate Reports. So just thinking about whether the story map is the right or wrong thing for you, I would say you need that story arc, you need a clear tie to location, and you need a lot of powerful media. And you need time. You need someone who's willing to work inside of that ecosystem, learn how to use ArcGIS Online, learn what the strictures are, what you can and can't do, and to really edit and pare down. Because once again, you're going to need to trim your thousands and thousands of words down to short little consumable chunks that you can put in there and tie to each image or tie to each point in your map. And so that's kind of what I've got. I'm happy to answer any questions. I want to leave some time for questions because I see a number of really good ones in the chat that I think we can speak to. So I guess I will throw this back to Elise. Are you leading the chat?
Yeah, I'm emceeing. So feel free to add your questions to the chat. I saw one that was for Heather. Heather, how do you avoid the problem of virtual newsletters like through MailChimp going into junk folders?
I'm actually going to make, sorry, okay, Mike and I are actually in the same room, which makes this very entertaining. Yeah, there's Mike's hand. I'm going to have Mike answer this question because Mike is way more techie than I am, and he has dealt with a lot of this stuff more than I have. So.
Yeah, so I've put together a number of these newsletters. We have run into them hitting the spam box. If people come to you and tell you that they're running into your spam box, then you just need them to whitelist the email address. Unfortunately, this isn't something you can do on your side. The only other thing that we have run into that's really interesting is specific domains that have completely blocked MailChimp newsletters from landing in their mailbox. So if you have ever tried to send, in our case, we're working with the Army Corps of Engineers, and the entire ACE.mil email domain blocks MailChimp. So they're not allowed to receive them. And so as a result, what we end up doing is sending it out, and then I copy all of the content, essentially copy that newsletter in and send out a separate email to our ACE contacts. So you may have to just figure that out with your audience, but if it's just a matter of a couple of folks having it hit their spam folder, then I would just go through that MailChimp process, send them the link from MailChimp that explains how to whitelist an email address.
Great, thanks. Carly, I think you already answered this question in the chat, but it was a question about if there are sort of free audio clips or royalty-free audio clips that people could pull from to make podcasts.
Yeah, you could get in a lot of trouble if you use music that's copyrighted. So there are some resources online, and I'll share a couple of links in a follow-up after this, and we could post it on our website. But yeah, it could also be as simple as I kind of mentioned in the chat, just going out for a walk, taking your phone and, recording the birds chirping, or, a stream or a waterfall, people cutting up food, or, just as you start to kind of look around, you could kind of think about, different audio clips that are really cool, like even just like, opening paper or a book or things like that. Those are kind of cool things to kind of insert into your podcast too. But I'll share some resources for some royalty-free music and audio.
All right, and then one group question. I think maybe we'll start with you, Rod. you guys have each talked about how to speak and include community voices. We're wondering if you could talk about how to speak with communities and not just to communities.
I saw that, excuse me, I saw that in the chat, and I was starting to think about that with what I do as a science, excuse me, science communicator, writing press releases primarily. I think speaking with a community would fall in with specifying the impact of the research to communities and giving examples of, this scientist is, this research does X, and here's how it affects primarily these communities in Alaska, for example. I don't know that for press release purposes, I would go and seek community comment in the press release, because it's not truly like a story, a news story, but I would try to include references to impacted areas. That's what I can think of at the moment. Heather, you have anything like that in what you do?
Sure. We've done this quite a bit in several of our newsletters. Like in the AOK newsletter, we have an observer corner where we, some of the local community observers who are part of the project, we ask somebody each newsletter to submit just their thoughts on how the project's going or whatever else they want to talk about. And that's been really cool. I would say that it takes more time because sometimes, like, we've actually had people mail in their content. So that means you just need to build that time in if that's a priority. The other thing that I've done with some of the other newsletters where we actually wanted community feedback, because with the print newsletters, like, people are really unlikely to actually go fill out a Google form. So we've actually included postcards that you can tear out of the newsletter, and then you can use business reply mail to mail it back to us with their questions. And then we've tried to incorporate those questions into how we create the next newsletter. So that's one way that, like, we try and provide answers to people's questions. But yeah, so anyway, I don't know if that answers the question, but I'll pass it off to Mike or Carly.
Let's see, am I gonna? Oh, cool. So I would say with the story maps thing in particular, it's really important. For two of the story maps that I showed and I've had experience with, we've got very different community speaking through the story map as well, parts of that. The AOK project is built almost exclusively on community observations. So a lot of that, the photos and the stories and the audio was already there, but it was very important for the author and for the project and for myself to make sure that we were telling the story in the right way, that everyone who was participating was happy with the results, was happy with the way that their story was being told. And so that lengthened the process a little bit, because it was a lot of back and forth where we chatted about what the good storylines would be, and then found the audio and the photos that were perfect to illustrate that point, and then made sure that after we had built it, we went out to those folks. Are you happy with this? Can you look at this and make sure that this is how you are happy with your story being told through that media? In the case of the glacial lake outburst flooding, it was Juneau's a big city by Alaska standards. And so we had a lot of folks who were specifically engaged with that project. So the local emergency management office in Juneau, interviews were done and folks chatted about that. And then that was looped into the videos and the story map that you can read, so that we get the perspective of Juneau City emergency management preparing for this flood at the same time as the researchers are getting on a helicopter and going out to study the thickness of the ice or the depth of the water. That's a little bit more straightforward. It looks more like a traditional media or PIO communication strategy versus the network of observers in rural communities, which has a very bespoke and meaningful and specific way of communicating with folks that was really important to everybody involved in that project. And I'll hand it off to you, Carly.
Yeah, I know we're kind of at time, but just really quickly, those are, really important things to think about when it comes to communicating, just science communication in general, or just communicating with communities. factors to consider, like working with minors, working across cultures beyond your own, working with vulnerable populations. For example, some things might require IRB consent from the institution. So those are things to kind of think about as you start to prepare for your podcast or your media piece. Things to kind of keep in mind that are really important first steps.
Well, big thanks to everyone. Thank you, Carly, Mike, Rod, and Heather for sharing your experiences with us today. I'm going to let you go, but I want to plug a few NNA things before we go. The NNA annual community meeting is coming up in just a couple of weeks here. We'll be at a couple different AGU sessions in December, so please find us there. And we have an inclusive mentoring workshop coming up in January, and we'll send out these links for the Eventbrite. And then finally, you'll find the link for the Learn and Connect series survey in the chat, and we'll also send that out in a follow-up email. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for your time today, and thanks for learning with us.
Thanks for having us.